In the unforgiving winter of 1876, a single selfless act by a 6-year-old girl would ignite a firestorm of fear, paranoia, and mystery that would threaten to consume an entire town. When little Sarah Walker gave her only blanket to a freezing native baby, she didn't know she was setting in motion a chain of events that would defy all logic of the wild frontier. What the tribe did next wasn't just shocking. It was a cryptic puzzle that turned neighbor against neighbor and pushed her family to the brink of madness. This is the true story of a life-saving gift and the terrifying, unexpected price of kindness. The wind was a living thing on the plains of Montana that winter of 1876. It howled with the voice of a starving wolf clawing at the log seams of the small cabin that Josiah Walker had built with his own 2 hands. Inside, the world had shrunk to the flickering circle of light cast by a tallow lamp and the radiant heat of the pot-bellied stove. For 6-year-old Sarah Walker, this little bubble of warmth was the entire universe. Her world was the smell of pine smoke, the rough texture of her father's flannel shirt, and the soft, comforting weight of the patchwork quilt her mother had sewn for her. The quilt was Sarah's most prized possession. It wasn't beautiful by any standard, but her own. Made from salvaged scraps of old work shirts, faded calico dresses, and even a piece of a canvas wagon cover. It was a map of her family's life. A faded blue square was from the shirt her father wore, building their home. A patch of yellow floral print was from the dress her mother Mary had worn on their journey west. Sarah knew the story of every single piece. At night, she'd trace the stitching with her small fingers, whispering to the memories held within the fabric. It was her shield against the dark, her comfort against the keening wind. On this particular afternoon, the wind carried more than just snow. It carried the faint rhythmic crunch of footsteps. Josiah heard it first. His body went rigid, his hand instinctively reaching for the stock of the Winchester rifle that always leaned against the wall. He was a hard man, his face a road map of sun-baked lines and anxious furrows etched by the constant vigilance the frontier demanded. He had seen enough, heard enough stories to know that unexpected visitors in a blizzard were rarely a good omen. "Mary, take Sarah to the loft," he said, his voice low and steady, a command that brooked no argument. Mary Walker, a woman whose gentle features were perpetually shadowed by worry, scooped Sarah into her arms. "It's just the wind, my love," she whispered, though her own trembling hands betrayed her fear. From the shadows of the sleeping loft, peering through a crack between the rough-hewn floorboards, Sarah watched her father unbar the door. The sight that greeted him stole the breath from Sarah's lungs. 5 figures stood huddled against the swirling snow, their forms almost lost in the whiteout. They were Crow, their dark hair and buckskin clothing dusted with a thick layer of frost. They didn't look menacing. They looked desperate. Their leader, a tall man with a face like carved granite, held up an empty hand in the universal sign of peace. But it wasn't the men who held Sarah's attention. It was the woman near the back of the group. She was young, her face gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. Clutched to her chest was a small bundle. As the wind tore at her thin blanket, Sarah caught a glimpse of a tiny, still face, its skin tinged with a terrifying shade of blue. A baby. And it was freezing. Josiah stood in the doorway, a human wall between his family and the strangers. His stance was uncompromising. "We have nothing for you," he said, his voice as harsh as the wind. "Move on." The leader spoke his words in the crow language, guttural and pleading, but Josiah shook his head. I don't speak your tongue. There's sickness in the valley. We can't help you. Go. The woman with the baby took a hesitant step forward, her eyes dark pools of desperation locking with Mary's. She pulled back the covering from the infant's face, revealing the silent, unmoving child. A tiny choked sound escaped Mary's lips. As a mother, she understood the silent plea that transcended language. She looked at Josiah, her expression imploring. Jed, please, she murmured. The baby. No. He snapped, his fear making him cruel. We have our own child to think of. We take them in. We risk everything. Sickness or worse. We don't have enough for ourselves. Now go. He raised the rifle slightly, a clear and final threat. The Crow party seemed to understand. A wave of despair passed through them. The tall leader placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder and gently began to guide her away. They turned their backs to the cabin, preparing to be swallowed once more by the blizzard. Up in the loft, Sarah felt a pang so sharp it was like a physical blow. She saw the baby's blue-tinged skin, the mother's hopeless tears freezing on her cheeks. She looked down at the beloved quilt clutched in her own hands, the quilt that kept her warm and safe every single night. In the simple, unclouded logic of a 6-year-old, there was no choice to be made. Before Mary could stop her, Sarah scrambled down the ladder. Wait! She cried out, her small voice cutting through the wind's howl. Everyone froze. Josiah turned his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The Crow party stopped and looked back. Sarah ran past her father, her little legs pumping as she plunged into the knee-deep snow. She didn't feel the cold, only the desperate urgency of her mission. She reached the young mother and without a moment's hesitation held out her precious quilt. For the baby, she said, her voice clear and certain. The woman stared first at the quilt, then at the small child offering it. Tears streamed down her face as she reached out a trembling hand and took the offered warmth. She quickly, deftly wrapped her motionless infant in the thick patchwork fabric, cocooning it in the layers of love and memory that Sarah had cherished for so long. She looked at Sarah, her dark eyes conveying a depth of emotion that no words could capture. She touched her own heart, then pointed to Sarah, then to the sky. A promise, a blessing, an acknowledgement of a profound connection. Josiah stood, stunned into silence. He watched as the Crow woman turned and followed her companions the bright colors of his daughter's quilt, a stark, vibrant splash against the monochrome fury of the storm. They disappeared into the swirling whiteness, leaving behind only their footprints and an unnerving, deafening silence. The spell was broken when Josiah grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip painfully tight. "What have you done?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You foolish, foolish child, what in God's name have you done?" He dragged her back into the cabin, slamming the door and ramming the bar into place as if trying to shut out the consequences of her actions. Mary rushed to Sarah, wrapping her in her arms, but her own face was pale with fear. "She was just being kind, Jed," Mary pleaded. "Kind!" He roared, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "That wasn't kindness, Mary. That was a death warrant. They don't think like we do. They won't see a gift. They'll see a debt or a weakness. You don't give them something for nothing. They'll be back. You mark my words, they'll be back. And they won't be coming for a friendly chat." That night, for the first time in her life, Sarah Walker went to sleep without her quilt. The bed felt cold and empty. But it wasn't the cold that kept her awake. It was the terrifying image of her father's face, and the echo of his words promising a future she was too young to understand, but old enough to dread. Her act of simple childish compassion had planted a seed of terror in the heart of her family, and as the blizzard raged outside, that seed began to grow. The blizzard blew itself out over the next 2 days, leaving behind a world remade in pristine, treacherous white. The silence that descended was more unnerving than the storm's fury. Every snap of a frozen branch, every rustle of a foraging squirrel sent Josiah lunging for his rifle. He became a ghost in his own home, his eyes sunken, darting towards the windows at the slightest sound. He forbade Sarah from playing outside, keeping her confined to the cabin as if it were a fortress under siege. "They'll be back," he'd mutter to himself, cleaning his Winchester for the 10th time. "They know where we are now. They know we're isolated." Mary tried to reason with him. "Josiah, it's been 3 days. They're likely miles away by now. They were just a family in need." "A family?" He scoffed, his voice raw with contempt. "They're a scouting party, Mary. You don't see it. They were testing our defenses, seeing how soft we were. And our daughter showed them. She handed them an invitation on a silver platter." His fear was not born of thin air. Before settling in Montana, Josiah had worked as a freighter hauling goods through territories where skirmishes between settlers and tribes were a brutal reality. He'd seen the aftermath of raids, the burned-out wagons, and the hastily dug graves. He carried the ghosts of that past with him, and they whispered to him in the oppressive silence of the snow-covered plains. He saw every shadow as a warrior, every gust of wind as a war cry. His anger and fear curdled, and much of it was directed unfairly at Sarah. He looked at her and saw not his innocent daughter, but the architect of their impending doom. He spoke to her in clipped, harsh tones, his previous warmth buried under a thick layer of dread. Sarah, feeling the chill of her father's disapproval, far more than the winter air, retreated into herself. She stopped humming the little songs her mother had taught her. She sat for hours by the cold window, her small face a portrait of quiet misery, watching the empty white landscape and waiting. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for, but her father's terror had become her own. A week after the encounter, the need for supplies became critical. The blizzard had depleted their reserves of flour and salt, and Josiah knew he could put off a trip to the nearest settlement, Blackwood Creek, no longer. The settlement was little more than a dozen rough-hewn buildings huddled in a shallow valley, a precarious outpost of civilization 20 miles away. It was a place of hard-bitten, suspicious people, all of whom shared Josiah's anxieties about the land and its native inhabitants. He harnessed the 2 sturdy draft horses to the sleigh, his movements stiff and reluctant. "Mary, keep the door barred. Don't open it for anyone. And I mean anyone. Shoot through the door if you have to." He looked at Sarah for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before turning and cracking the whip. The journey to Blackwood Creek did little to soothe his nerves. The landscape felt hostile, the towering pines like silent, watching sentinels. He imagined eyes following him from the dense thickets of willow and aspen that lined the frozen creek bed. When he finally arrived, the smoke curling from the chimneys of Blackwood Creek was a welcome sight. He tied his horses outside the general store, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a tinny jangle. The store owner, a portly man named Silas Croft, looked up from behind the counter. "Josiah, thought that blizzard might have buried you for good." Silas said, his attempt at humor falling flat. A few other men were in the store, loitering around the warmth of the stove. Among them was the town's self-appointed authority, Sheriff Bartholomew Barth Thorne. Thorne wasn't an officially elected lawman. He'd simply taken the role upon himself by virtue of being the biggest, loudest, and most intimidating man in the valley. He was a former buffalo hunter, with a drooping mustache and pale, cold eyes that missed nothing. He cultivated an atmosphere of fear, believing it was the only thing that kept a place like Blackwood Creek from tearing itself apart. "Just ran low on flour," Josiah said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Everything all right out at your place?" Sheriff Thorne asked, his gaze sharp. "Heard some of the Crow were pushed down this way by the storm." Josiah hesitated. A part of him wanted to keep the incident to himself, to contain the shame and fear within his own cabin walls. But the pressure in his chest was too great. The story spilled out of him first as a trickle, then as a flood. He told them about the 5 braves, the woman, the freezing baby. When he got to the part about Sarah and the quilt, he couldn't bring himself to look at the other men. He stared at a crack in the floorboards as he confessed what his daughter had done. The store fell silent. Silas Croft stopped weighing out the flour. The other men exchanged uneasy glances. It was Sheriff Thorne who spoke first, his voice dripping with a grim, "I told you so" satisfaction. "Well, Walker," Thorne said, stroking his mustache, "you've got yourself a real problem." "It was just a child's mistake," Josiah said weakly. "There are no mistakes like that out here." Thorne countered, his voice rising. "There's only life and death. You think they see a blanket. They see a sign. They see that you're weak, that you're willing to give things away. They'll be back for more. First a blanket, next your horses, then your food, then—" He let the sentence hang in the air, pregnant with menace. Another man, a wiry trapper named Elias Kent, chimed in. "Thorne's right, Jed. My brother's family down on the Powder River. They tried to be friendly. Gave 'em food. A month later, the whole homestead was burned to the ground. They take kindness as an insult, some of 'em. Like you think they can't provide for themselves." The seeds of Josiah's private fear now found fertile ground in the collective paranoia of Blackwood Creek. His story became their story. His potential threat. Their potential threat. They saw the incident not as an isolated event at a remote cabin, but as the first move in a larger, terrifying game. Thorne clapped a heavy hand on Josiah's shoulder. "You need to be ready, Walker. We all do. This is how it starts. A single act of foolishness and the whole hornet's nest gets stirred up. You go home, you bar your door, and you pray they don't decide what you have is worth taking." Josiah left Blackwood Creek with his supplies, but he carried a much heavier burden. The town's fear had magnified his own, validating his darkest anxieties. He now saw his daughter's act not just as a mistake, but as a betrayal to the entire community. He had gone to the town seeking supplies, but had found only confirmation of his terror. As his sleigh cut through the snow on the journey home, the setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the trail. Every shadow looked like a warrior. Every tree seemed to hold an ambush. The 20 miles back to his cabin felt like 100, and with every mile the certainty grew in his heart. Sheriff Thorne was right. They were coming back. The only questions were when and what they would take next. For 5 days after Josiah's return from Blackwood Creek, the Walker cabin existed in a state of suspended animation. The oppressive silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire and Josiah's restless pacing. He had boarded up the smaller of the 2 windows and had taken to sleeping in a chair by the door, the Winchester cradled in his lap. Mary's attempts to bring a sense of normalcy to their lives were futile. The weight of Josiah's fear was a physical presence in the small space, smothering every flicker of hope. Sarah spent her days in the loft, a silent little ghost. She had a small, crudely carved wooden horse that her father had made for her in happier times, but she no longer played with it. Instead, she'd press her eye to the crack in the floorboards, watching her father, her small heart aching with a confusing mix of guilt and fear. She knew she was the cause of this dark cloud that had settled over their home. On the morning of the 6th day, the world outside was brilliant and still. The sun, a rare and welcome visitor, glinted off the crust of the snow, making it look like a field of diamonds. It was Mary who saw it first. She'd gone to the main window to let in some light, her body tensing as she scanned the perimeter of the clearing, as she now did a dozen times a day. "Josiah," she whispered, her voice taut. "Come here, quickly." Josiah was at her side in an instant, rifle in hand. He followed her trembling finger, his eyes narrowing. There on the flat top of the large tree stump, where he chopped wood, sat an object. It hadn't been there the night before. It was a package of some kind, neatly folded and tied with a leather thong. "Stay here," Josiah commanded, his face grim. "Keep the door locked behind me." Ignoring Mary's protests, he unbarred the door and stepped out into the biting cold. He moved cautiously, his boots crunching loudly in the silent morning. He circled the stump rifle raised, as if expecting it to explode. From the window, Mary and Sarah watched, their hearts pounding in unison. Finally convinced it was not a trap, Josiah prodded the package with the barrel of his rifle. Then, with a deep breath, he reached down and picked it up. He carried it back to the cabin at arm's length, as if it were a venomous snake. He placed it on the center of the table, and the three of them stood staring at it. "What is it?" Mary breathed. "I don't know," Josiah said, his voice husky. "A trick, a warning." With the tip of his hunting knife, he carefully sliced the leather thong. The package fell open. It was not a weapon. It was not a threat. It was a hide. But it was unlike any hide Josiah had ever seen. It was a deer skin, tanned to the color of rich cream, and as soft and supple as velvet. It was flawless, without a single scar or blemish. But it was the decoration that made them gasp. The entire surface of the hide was covered in a breathtakingly intricate pattern of beadwork. Tiny beads of sky blue, fiery red, and shining black had been sewn into the leather with painstaking precision, forming geometric shapes and symbols that seemed to vibrate with a life of their own. The craftsmanship was masterful, the result of hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of skilled labor. In the center of the hide, a single dominant symbol was beaded, a vibrant, multicolored star, representing the morning star, a symbol of hope and guidance in Crow culture. It was, by any measure, a treasure. A piece of functional art so beautiful and so valuable it would fetch a small fortune in any trading post. It was worth infinitely more than the simple scrapwork wool quilt that Sarah had given away. Mary reached out a hesitant hand and touched the beadwork. "It's beautiful," she whispered in awe. Sarah, who had crept down from the loft, stared at it with wide, wondering eyes. "It's a present," she said, her first full sentence in days. "It's a thank you." Josiah recoiled as if she had suggested setting the cabin on fire. "No," he snarled, his brief moment of awe instantly replaced by a fresh wave of suspicion. "Don't you see, it's a mockery they're showing us what they have. They're showing us how rich they are, how little they needed our pathetic little blanket. This isn't a gift, it's a boast." He grabbed the hide from the table, his rough hands crumpling the beautiful beadwork. "Or worse." He continued, his mind racing down the dark corridors of his paranoia. "It's a marker, a sign to other raiding parties. The people in this cabin are fools. They are soft. Their property is ours for the taking. It's like painting a target on our own door. Josiah, no one would spend this much time and effort on a threat." Mary argued, her voice pleading. "Look at it. This is a thing of honor." "You know nothing of their ways," he shouted, his face contorted with rage. He saw the flash of hurt in her eyes and the fear in Sarah's, but he couldn't stop himself. His terror was a runaway train. He looked at Sarah, at her innocent, uncomprehending face, and the unfairness of it all boiled over. "This is your doing," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at her. This curse you've brought on us." He stormed out of the cabin, slamming the door behind him. He marched to the edge of the woods, the magnificent hide clutched in his fist, and threw it into a snowbank, as if trying to physically discard the mystery and fear it represented. But the image of it remained burned into his mind. The perfect tanning, the impossibly intricate beadwork, the silent, cryptic message it carried. It was a puzzle he couldn't solve, and that made it more terrifying than any open threat. An enemy you understood could be fought, but an enemy who repaid a simple kindness with an enigmatic treasure. That was a foe beyond his comprehension. Inside the cabin, Mary retrieved the deerskin from the snow, carefully brushing it clean. She folded it with reverence and placed it in her cedar chest, the scent of the wood mingling with the faint, smoky smell of the tanned leather. She looked at Sarah, who was crying silently, her small body shaking. Mary pulled her daughter into her arms, stroking her hair. "Your father is just scared, little one," she whispered. "He doesn't mean it." But Sarah knew, with the chilling certainty of a child who has seen the monster under the bed, that he did. She had tried to do a good thing. She had given away her warmth to save a life, and in return, a beautiful, terrifying mystery had been left on their doorstep. Her father saw it as a curse. She, in her heart of hearts, still believed it was a thank you. And this chasm of understanding that had opened up between them felt wider and more dangerous than the entire snow-covered expanse of the Montana wilderness. The discovery of the beaded deerskin marked a turning point. The acute, sharp-edged fear that had gripped Josiah began to morph into a chronic, gnawing paranoia. He didn't speak of the incident in Blackwood Creek again, ashamed of the confirmation his fears had received, and even more ashamed of the cryptic gift that defied their grim predictions. He became more withdrawn, more silent. His life governed by a grim, self-imposed watch. The magnificent hide remained hidden in Mary's cedar chest, a secret symbol of the schism within their family. Weeks turned into a month. The brutal winter clung to the valley with relentless tenacity. Game became scarce. Josiah would spend entire days tracking only to return empty-handed and exhausted, the lines on his face deepening with every failed hunt. Their supply of salted meat dwindled, and the gnawing ache of hunger became a constant, unwelcome guest in the small cabin. One morning, after a particularly fruitless hunt, Josiah woke before dawn to the sound of something thudding against the cabin door. He was instantly awake, his heart hammering against his ribs as he grabbed the Winchester. He crept to the door, listening. Silence. Taking a deep breath, he lifted the bar and pulled the door open a crack. Nothing. No one. He opened it wider and looked down. Lying on the doorstep was the carcass of a large buck, its neck cleanly broken. It was fresh steam still rising from its cooling body in the frigid morning air. It was a prime animal, larger and healthier than any Josiah had seen all season. There were no tracks in the snow leading to or from the cabin, save for his own, from the day before. It was as if the animal had simply materialized on his doorstep. Josiah stared at it, his mind reeling. He scanned the tree line, the silent, snow-laden pines. He saw nothing, heard nothing. But he felt it. He felt the presence of the watchers. He dragged the buck inside his movements, heavy with a dread that was now mixed with a profound and unsettling confusion. "Where did you get it?" Mary asked, her eyes wide, with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "It was left," he grunted, avoiding her gaze. "A gift," Sarah whispered from her corner, her voice filled with a child's simple certainty. "It's not a gift," Josiah snapped, his voice cracking. "It's a message they're showing us they can get this close whenever they want. They're showing us they can provide better than I can. It's a way to unman me, to break my spirit before they—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He began to butcher the deer with a frantic, desperate energy, the act of survival intertwined with a deep psychological torment. The venison fed them for weeks, but the taste of it was bittersweet for Josiah. Every bite was a reminder of his own failure and their mysterious benefactor's success. The strange gifts continued, each one timed with an almost supernatural prescience. When their supply of firewood ran low, they woke to find a perfectly stacked cord of dry, seasoned oak by the woodpile, chopped and ready for the stove. No tracks, just the wood. Then Mary fell ill. It started as a cough, but quickly descended into a fever that left her weak and delirious. Josiah recognized the signs of lung fever, a deadly affliction in such isolated conditions. He did what he could, brewing teas from the few herbs he knew, but her condition only worsened. Despair began to set in. He sat by her bedside, holding her hot, dry hand, the fear of losing her a cold knot in his stomach. One evening, as a new snow began to fall, he was startled by a soft scratching sound at the window pane. He jumped up, rifle ready, his heart leaping into his throat. He peered through the glass, expecting to see a face leering back at him. Instead, tucked into the window frame, was a small leather pouch tied with sinew. His hands shaking, he retrieved it. Inside was a collection of dried herbs and roots he didn't recognize. They were fragrant with the earthy scent of the deep woods. He didn't know what they were, but he was a desperate man. He looked at Mary, her breathing shallow and ragged, and made a choice. He boiled the contents of the pouch in water, creating a dark, pungent tea. He gently lifted Mary's head and helped her drink the bitter liquid. He sat with her through the night, watching, waiting. Towards dawn, something miraculous happened. Her fever broke. The sweat on her brow was cool, her breathing deepened and eased. By morning, though still weak, she was lucid, and the worst of the illness had passed. Josiah sat at the table, his head in his hands, completely undone. He was a man who believed in a world of clear lines and simple truths, hard work, self-reliance, and the ever-present threat of a hostile wilderness. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this. This cascade of inexplicable life-saving kindness from a people he had been taught to fear and hate. The news of these strange occurrences, however, did not stay confined to the Walker cabin. On a rare trip to Blackwood Creek for lamp oil, a gaunt and haunted-looking Josiah let slip the story of the deer. He couldn't help it. The mystery was a pressure cooker in his soul, and he had to release some of the steam. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Sheriff Thorne, who had been nursing the town's fear like a prized bourbon, seized on the news. "Are you blind, man?" Thorne bellowed in the middle of the general store for all to hear. "They're fattening you up. It's an old trick. They soften you, make you dependent. They're making a pet out of you before the slaughter." Elias Kent, the trapper, nodded in agreement. "Or worse, they're trying to put you in their debt. In their world, a debt like that is a powerful thing. They might come back and claim your daughter as payment for what you've taken." This new horrific idea struck Josiah like a physical blow. The thought that his daughter might be the ultimate price for the venison and the medicine sent a sliver of ice through his heart. The people of Blackwood Creek began to look at him differently. He was no longer just a potential victim. He was a collaborator, a pariah. The walkers were now seen as tainted, having entered into some kind of unholy pact with the enemy. Children were hurried inside when he passed. Men would stop talking and stare at him with cold, suspicious eyes. He and his family were utterly alone, isolated not just by the snow, but by the wall of fear and judgment erected by their own kind. The strain began to tear the Walker family apart. Mary, having been brought back from the brink by the pouch of herbs, saw the gifts as blessings, as a sign of a profound connection forged by Shreya's initial act. She tried to make Josiah see it. "They saved my life, Jed," she would plead. "They have shown us nothing but honor. How can you still see them as monsters? Because I don't understand it," he would yell, his voice full of anguish. "And I don't trust what I don't understand. They're playing with us, Mary. It's a game, and I don't know the rules." His obsession deepened. He barely slept his days, a blur of watching, his nights a torment of listening. The gifts of food, of firewood, of life-saving medicine had not brought peace. They had brought a more insidious kind of terror. A psychological warfare that was methodically dismantling his sanity, his marriage, and his relationship with the daughter who had started it all. He now looked at Sarah with a terrible, conflicted expression, seeing both the beloved child he wanted to protect and the innocent harbinger of a fate so strange and terrifying, he couldn't begin to imagine its conclusion. The final brutal blizzard of the season arrived in late February. It came not with the howling fury of the earlier storms, but with a deceptive quietness, a steady, relentless fall of heavy, wet snow that entombed the world in a thick, soundless blanket of white. For 3 days it did not stop. The drifts piled up against the cabin, burying the windows on the north side and climbing halfway up the door. The Walker family was completely and utterly sealed off from the world. Inside the cabin, a different kind of blizzard was raging. The last of the gifted venison was gone. Their own meager supplies were stretched to their absolute limit. The fire in the stove, their only source of heat, was fed by the last of the mysterious woodpile. When that was gone, they would start burning the furniture. Mary, though recovered from the lung fever, was gaunt and frail. The oppressive atmosphere in the cabin seemed to sap her remaining strength. She moved about her chores with a listless, ghostly grace, her eyes full of a quiet sorrow. But the greatest change was in Josiah. The lack of sleep, the constant anxiety, and the gnawing hunger had pushed him to the edge of reason. He was a crooked bear, his eyes walled and bloodshot, his temper a powder keg with a dangerously short fuse. He had come to see the Crow tribe not just as a threat, but as a malevolent intelligence toying with him, orchestrating his slow descent into madness. Every good deed they had performed was, in his twisted logic, an act of profound cruelty designed to break him. The breaking point came on the 4th day of the storm. Sarah, weak with hunger, stumbled and knocked over the small pail of drinking water, spilling the last of their fresh water onto the dirt floor. Something inside Josiah snapped. He let out a roar of pure, unadulterated rage that made the very timbers of the cabin seem to shake. "You careless, stupid girl!" he bellowed, his face a purple mask of fury. He took a menacing step towards her. His hand raised. "Josiah, no!" Mary screamed, throwing herself between them. "She's just a child. She's hungry." Josiah froze his hand, trembling in mid-air. He looked at his wife's terrified face, at his daughter's tear-streaked cheeks, and the rage collapsed into a raw, shuddering despair. He stumbled back, sinking into a chair and burying his face in his hands. "I can't do this anymore." He choked out, his body racked with sobs. "They've won. They've broken me. I can't live like this, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I have to know. I have to face them." Mary's blood ran cold. "What are you saying? You can't go out in this. You'll die." "I'm dying in here," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I have to end it, one way or another. I have to go to them and demand an answer. I'll make them tell me what they want. If they mean to kill me, then let them do it and be done with it. It's better than this slow torture." He stood up, his eyes shining with a feverish, resolute madness. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his feet in burlap sacks for extra insulation, and grabbed his rifle. "Jed, for the love of God, don't do this!" Mary wept, clinging to his arm. He gently but firmly removed her hands. He looked at Sarah, who was huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. For the first time in months, a flicker of the old warmth returned to his eyes. "I'm sorry, Sarah Bell," he whispered, using his old pet name for her. "I'm so sorry." He unbarred the door. It took all his strength to shove it open against the immense weight of the snowdrift. A wall of white greeted him. Without a backward glance, he plunged into it and was gone. The journey was a hallucinatory nightmare. The snow was waist-deep, and the air so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass. The world had no landmarks, no horizon, just an endless, suffocating whiteness. Josiah had no idea where the Crow winter camp was, only a vague sense of the direction from which he'd seen them approach weeks ago. He pushed forward on pure, desperate instinct. Hours bled into one another. He fell, he rose, he stumbled on. His mind, starved of food and sleep, began to play tricks on him. He saw shadows flitting at the edge of his vision. He heard his name whispered on the wind. He was no longer just a man. He was a vessel of pure, primal fear and determination. Just as his body was about to give out, as the sweet, deadly temptation of simply lying down in the snow began to overwhelm him, he smelled it. The faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke, hope or something like it, surged through him. He staggered forward, and then he saw it, a shallow basin protected from the worst of the wind, where a handful of hide lodges or teepees stood silently in the snow. He had found them. Back in Blackwood Creek, the blizzard had also taken its toll. Sheriff Barth Thorne, restless and emboldened by his own authority, saw the storm as an opportunity. He gathered the men of his newly formed militia in the general store. "The walkers are snowed in tight," he announced, his voice booming with authority. "Jed hasn't been seen in days. This is it. This is the time the Crow will make their move. They'll see them as weak, cut off from help. We're going to go out there. We're going to rescue the walkers, and we are going to deal with this threat once and for all." We'll show them what happens when they try to play their games with the folks of Blackwood Creek." The men, their own fears stoked by Thorne's rhetoric and the claustrophobia of the storm, readily agreed. It was a chance to do something to fight back against the faceless anxieties that plagued them. They were not going on a rescue mission. They were going on a raid. Josiah, meanwhile, half crawled, half stumbled into the center of the Crow camp. Figures emerged from the lodges, their faces grim and wary at the sight of this wild-eyed white man with a rifle. Josiah barely saw them. He was focused on the largest lodge in the center of the camp, the chief's lodge. He shoved aside the hide flap and burst in the rifle held before him. He was ready for a fight, for a final bloody confrontation. The interior of the lodge was warm and smoky. An old man with a face like a wrinkled map and eyes as dark and wise as the night sky sat by the central fire. This was the chief. He looked at Josiah, not with aggression, but with a calm, patient curiosity. But Josiah's eyes were not on the chief. They were drawn to a woman sitting on the other side of the fire. It was the young woman from the storm, and in her arms, sleeping peacefully, was a healthy, chubby-cheeked baby. And wrapped snugly around that baby was a familiar, colorful patchwork of faded blue, flannel-yellow calico and canvas. Sarah's quilt. Josiah's rifle sagged in his hands. His mind, already stretched to its limit, struggled to process the scene. It was so peaceful, so domestic. It was the absolute antithesis of the violent, terrifying confrontation he had envisioned. The chief spoke, his voice low and raspy. Another younger man who had followed Josiah in began to translate his English, halting but clear. "He asks why you have come into his home with a weapon looking for death," the translator said. Josiah couldn't speak. He could only point a trembling finger at the baby and the quilt. My daughters," he stammered. The chief's expression softened. He spoke again, a long, flowing speech, his hands making gentle, expressive gestures. The translator listened intently before speaking. "He says his name is 2 Moons. Many winters ago, his own daughter, his firstborn, died in a blizzard just like this one. She was a baby. He says his heart was frozen in the snow with her." The chief paused, his eyes looking into the fire as if seeing a ghost. "He says when his son's wife came back to camp that day," the translator continued, nodding toward the young mother, "she told him a story of a little white-haired girl with a spirit of great courage and kindness, a girl who gave away her own warmth so that a stranger's child might live. The child, you see," the translator said, his voice full of emotion, "is his granddaughter." Josiah stared at the baby, truly seeing her for the first time. She was not a pawn in a game. She was a child, a beloved child. "When he saw what your daughter did," the translator went on, "he said it was a sign from the Great Spirit. It was as if his own lost daughter had been given back to him. His heart, frozen for so long, began to thaw. His daughter-in-law was so moved she has given the baby a new name. She calls her Sah-Ra-Na, the one who was saved by Sarah." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place in Josiah's mind with the force of a physical blow. The deerskin, the venison, the firewood, the medicine. "The gifts," Josiah whispered, his voice choked with a dawning, soul-crushing shame. The chief understood the English word and nodded, speaking again. He says, the translator explained, that in your world a gift can be a simple thing. In his world, the gift of a life is the greatest debt of all. It cannot be repaid with a simple thank you. It must be repaid with honor. He saw your family not as enemies, but as kin. Your daughter's spirit made you family. We were not threatening you. We were protecting you. We were honoring our debt by keeping our new family safe and provided for during the hard winter. We were treating you as we would treat our own. The truth was so simple, so profound, and so utterly contrary to everything he had believed that Josiah Walker fell to his knees in the middle of the Crow Lodge. The Winchester clattered to the floor. The blizzard of fear and paranoia that had raged in his heart for months was finally devastatingly over, and in its place was a vast, empty landscape of shame and the horrifying realization of what was at that very moment heading their way from Blackwood Creek. He had not been the target of a curse. He had been the recipient of a profound blessing, and he had been too blind, too full of hate and fear to see it. The truth settled upon Josiah Walker, not with the gentle relief of understanding, but with the crushing weight of a collapsing mountain. The warmth of the lodge, the sleeping baby, the wise eyes of Chief Two Moons. It all painted a picture of such profound honor that his own months-long campaign of fear felt like a profane sacrilege. The shame was a physical sickness churning in his gut, but in the next heartbeat, shame was consumed by a far more immediate and visceral terror. Thorn. He gasped the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing to the men of Blackwood Creek marinating in the poison he himself had spread. Sheriff Thorn and the militia. They're coming. They think you are the enemy. They are coming to attack you. The serene atmosphere in the lodge evaporated. Two Moons rose his aged features, transforming instantly from a grandfather's calm to a war chief's focused intensity. He barked a series of sharp commands. The young translator turned to Josiah, his voice grim. He says they will not find your tracks in this storm. They will go to your cabin first. My wife, my daughter, Josiah cried, a fresh wave of panic seizing him. Mary and Sarah were alone directly in the path of a righteous, misguided mob. Two Moons placed a steadying hand on Josiah's shoulder, his gaze cutting through the panic. We will ride, the chief declared through the translator. We will stop this. Minutes later, a dozen Crow warriors were mounted their horses, restless in the deep snow. They were not riding to fight a war, but to protect a family they had adopted as their own. They pulled Josiah onto a spare horse, and the group surged into the white chaos of the blizzard. They moved with a speed and certainty that defied the elements their purpose, a burning flame against the biting cold. Josiah rode with them, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, praying they would not be too late. They burst from the tree line into the clearing of the Walker homestead, to a scene poised on the knife edge of slaughter. Bath Thorn and his militia of a dozen men were there, their rifles at the ready. Having found Josiah gone, Thorn had drawn the darkest conclusion. He saw the approaching riders with Josiah among them, and his twisted narrative was fulfilled. There they are, Thorn bellowed, his voice ringing with grim satisfaction. They've taken Walker prisoner. Ready your arms, fire. A single shot cracked the frigid air, the bullet zipping past Josiah's head with a lethal hiss. The men from Blackwood Creek raised their rifles, their faces grim masks of fear and duty, ready to unleash hell upon the very people who had saved Josiah's family. No, stop! Josiah's scream was a raw, primal sound of pure desperation. He kicked his horse, breaking from the Crow warriors and plunging into the open space between the two factions. He threw his hands into the air, an unarmed, solitary figure against the backdrop of the dying sun. Hold your fire. You are wrong. God help us. You are all wrong. The militia hesitated, their fingers frozen on their triggers, stunned by the sight of Josiah alive, free, and utterly frantic. It's a trick, Thorn roared, desperate to keep control. They've turned him, don't listen! But Josiah's anguish was too real to be a lie. With the eyes of every man fixed on him, he began his confession. The words tumbled out, a torrent of truth washing away months of fear. He told them of Sarah's quilt and how it had saved a dying baby. He described the magnificent deerskin not as a taunt, but as a gift of immense honor. He told them of the deer that appeared when they were starving and the potent herbs that saved Mary's life from lung fever, each a gift in a sacred chain of reciprocity. His voice cracked as he delivered the final devastating truth. That baby, she is Chief Two Moon's granddaughter. Her life was a gift from my daughter, and in their world, a life debt is repaid with honor. They made us their kin. They were not threatening us. They were protecting us. He pointed a shaking finger at the men from Blackwood Creek, then brought it back to his own chest. We were too blind, too full of hate to see it. We are the ones who brought the darkness here. We are the monsters. A heavy ringing silence descended upon the clearing. The militia members lowered their rifles, their expressions shifting from aggression to confusion, and then to a slow dawning shame. They looked from Josiah's tear-streaked face to the stoic dignity of Chief Two Moons and his warriors. The entire foundation of their fear had been shattered. Thorn, seeing his power evaporate in the cold air, raised his pistol. He's lying, he snarled, aiming at the chief in a last desperate act of violence. Before he could fire, the cabin door creaked open and a small figure darted out. It was Sarah. Ignoring the guns and the tension, she ran to her father's side. In her small hands, she clutched the crude wooden horse he had carved for her. She held it up to Chief Two Moons, her small face resolute. The old chief dismounted with a weary grace. He walked to the little girl and knelt in the snow before her, his stern face softening into a gentle smile. He accepted the humble toy with solemn reverence. Then from a pouch at his side, he produced a small, exquisitely beaded doll and placed it carefully into her hands. That simple, silent exchange, a gift for a gift, was a truth more powerful than any weapon. It severed the last thread of Thorn's hateful narrative. One by one, the men from his militia turned their backs on him, their shoulders slumped with the weight of their folly. Disgraced and utterly alone. Thorn lowered his pistol, mounted his horse, and rode away into the deepening twilight, a man consumed by the very shadows he had sought to create. A fragile peace settled over the snowbound valley. In its quiet, a bridge was being built. A year later, as the next winter's snows blanketed the ground, that bridge was a well-traveled path. Before the Walker cabin, a fire burned brightly, and its light fell upon two little girls playing together in the snow, their laughter mingling in the crisp air. Sarah and Sarana, a child of the homestead and a child of the crow, shared a game understood without words, their innocent joy a living testament to the incredible, shocking power of a single act of kindness. The story of Sarah Walker and the blanket is a powerful reminder that our perceptions shape our reality. What one man saw as a terrifying curse was in fact an incredible blessing. It's a story about how the simple, unclouded compassion of a child could cut through generations of fear and misunderstanding. ultimately saving not just one life, but an entire community from itself. It challenges us to question our own fears, to look beyond our prejudices, and to consider that an act of kindness, no matter how small, can send ripples of goodness out into the world in ways we can never predict. If this story of courage, conviction, and unexpected connection moved you, please help us share it by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story of hope, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories that reveal the hidden depths of the human spirit. Thank you for watching.